Coming to you direct from the nerve center of the galaxy's greatest comic. This is the 2000 AD Thrillcast.
Borag Thung athletes, and welcome to the latest episode of the 2000 AD Thrillcast Lockdown Tapes. I am your host, as always, Mulchar, and on this episode we have a couple of terrific twosomes. We have Chris Weston and Simon Furman, who are the creative team on House of Dolmann in the forthcoming Smash special, which is coming out at the end of this month. Now, House of Dolmann is one of those creepy, weird, gothic series from classic British comics about a guy basically who's got a little army of robotic puppets, and he puts his voice into them and all sorts of madness. But Chris and Simon have done a strip for the new special, which is really nice. A couple of spoilers in our chat, but nothing major, so you can still enjoy it at the end of this month. Our second twosome are Jarrod and MJ from Doomrocket.com, which is a excellent comics news and criticism website. They're on here to do a deep dive into Halo Jones, that seminal classic series from 2000 AD by Alan Moore and Ian Gibson. It's great to get their perspective on such an important series for 2000 AD, and one that's always brought up when people are talking about how well 2000 AD does characters, such unusual, out of the ordinary. So without much further ado, we're going to crack on with the latest episode. Thank you to all the feedback we've been getting. Some really great suggestions coming in of artists and writers that we can talk to in future episodes, so we will be looking into those, have no fear. But first off, let's talk to Chris Weston and Simon Furman about the House of Dolmann. So, Guy, I mean, I've often bored Simon at length at the pub meets in London about my youth reading Transformer comics. And also Chris, we've talked extensively about your Dread work, but the House of Dolman strip for Smash Special, I think sort of brings you both together on something that really plays to the strengths of both your work. I kind of want to explore a little bit how you came to be on the project in the first place, and how you started the process of reviving what I'm going to go out on a limb here and say was not necessarily a massively well-known character these days.
Yeah, I mean, well, for me, obviously I was kind of already involved in the rebellion superhero British comics verse, all those legacy characters with the Vigilant. So, I'd been working with Keith Richardson on bringing these characters back into, the modern day, I guess, and giving them a slightly fresh coat of paint, but with due reverence to what came before. Because I don't know about Chris, and but for me, these were very much the comics I grew up reading. So, the characters were important to me in the way that I guess Transformers are to Transformers fans. It's what you grow up reading and you got passionate and inspired by, and Lion, Smash, Valiant, they were very much my comics of reading choice every week. So it's been a dream job for me, really has.
Well, I discovered those characters through that Fleetway reprint title called Vulcan. So I had no idea they'd existed before that. And I know, and Vulcan, of course, is where I discovered Don Lawrence's artwork. But pretty much this Smash special is like an issue of Vulcan. It's because Vulcan had like Steelclaw, the Spider, House of Dolmann, the Mighty Mitek, and so this is a great nostalgia trip for me as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that House of Dolman was really originally a Valiant strip. So, it is almost like cherry picking from a range of titles under the Smash Special banner. But that's great, really, because much as I loved Smash, it didn't have a huge amount of standout strips in it. So,
what were the standout strips?
well, bizarrely for me, because I always like the weird and quirky ones, there was one called Master of the Marsh about some guy who thinks he's Hereward the Wake or something and becomes school teacher at this stereotypically British public school. And it's bonkers when you read it now, but I think
sounds like Dr. Sin or something.
Yeah, it's just weird how these strips got out there and nobody questioned them at the time. Just oddball. But, that's why I was so pleased to work on House of Dolman, because it had that strange, curious, British, eccentric vibe to it all the way through.
Yeah.
I mean, what is the enduring appeal? Because we'll come on to talking more specifically about your strip in a minute. But what is the enduring appeal of these strips? Because Chris, you encountered them through reprints, so clearly, there was constant life in these characters. But what do you think is the enduring appeal of these old archive characters that, as you say, Simon, are just sometimes some of them are just bonkers.
I don't know. I mean, they're really creepy as well, aren't they? I mean, when with all of those characters, the Steelclaw, House of Dolman, and the Spider, were more Steelclaw and the Spider. They spent a good portion of their careers being supervillains rather than superheroes, weren't they? It's only sort of towards the later of the run where because the kids loved them so much, that they decided to turn them into heroes. I mean, House of Dolman, they're heroes from the off, but you'd hardly know it because these dolls are so ugly, and you got like some of them are missing limbs, aren't they? Got like weird prosthetic hands and things. They look like villains.
They were sort of Chucky before Chucky, weren't they? I mean, they were just slightly off-kilter and unsettling, even in, I'm sure they weren't deliberately drawn that way, but boy, do they come across as creepy a lot of the time.
They're really unhinged as well, aren't they? I mean, you've got the giggler who's just like manic laughing. It's like the Joker. And again, a villain.
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe it just ties into the whole British, love of, more hatred of authority, really. Like one of the most famous British characters is Dennis the Menace. You can't get more of an authoritarian figure than that. And I think all of these characters sort of have got an element of that in them.
I mean, there is a tradition in British comics of strips where the focal character is just the villain, Dr. Mesmer's Revenge, von Hoffman's Invasion, the White Eyes.
Yeah.
There's normally a pair of plucky school kids trying to stop them, but largely they're villain strips. And that's what I loved about British comics. You just didn't get that so much in Marvel DC output.
Why do you think that's a uniquely British thing with comic characters?
I think the Italians go for it as well, don't they? A lot of the Italian comic books, like Danger, Diabolic, most of their sort of fumetti feature supervillains. I mean, I've got a big book on like Italian comic book characters, and most of them are supervillains. But aside from Italians, I can't think of another country that digs the bad guys as much as we do.
I mean, the strange thing was, it was almost like British comics were pushing in a different direction completely to the American comics, and almost sort of knowingly going their own way in a very sort of subversive counterculture way, which was to say, look, it's dark and ugly out there, it's weird and wonderful, and not as cut and dried as good, evil, or whatever.
Yeah.
So
I mean, because Josh Dredd's the bad guy.
Yep.
When I had David Roach on the podcast a few weeks ago talking about the Masters of British Comic Art book, sorry about the noise in the background, someone's hammering a massive steel pillar into the ground. Comics weren't necessarily a working class medium, but very early on there were those cheap papers that were put out there that did feature quite a lot of satire, quite a lot of undermining of figures of authority. There's a long conversation to be had about British attitudes towards authority, etc., etc. And by the time you get to the 60s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, these comic characters have been honed down to this. Yeah, basically they're the bad guy, and we're as much cheering for their ingenuity and their deviousness as we are for the people who are thwarting them in the first place, because they're always thwarted. Simon, you mentioned von Hoffman's invasion. Really loud. With he wasn't trying to like attack serious targets like oil refineries or nuclear power stations or whatever. It was always like the church fate or something like that. There's a wonderful sense of scale in that as well, almost also bringing threats down, minimizing them, saying actually as terrible as it is, even if a Nazi scientist creates massive wasps, it can be brought low by the power of innocence of children and whatnot. And I guess that neatly brings us on to talking about House of Dolman, which is literally the smallest things you can imagine kind of in this situation. And this is almost like the anti-Toy Story, really, isn't it?
They are quite childlike as well. I mean, he's quite a paternal figure, Dolman, isn't he?
Well, I mean, he literally calls them his children, which, I put one little instruction in the script. It's like the other guy in the room is looking at him like, what are you saying? My children. I mean, it's just creepy. And then you add to that thing that they're all him. He's talking to himself. He's the ultimate multi-personality. He's arguing and sort of ridiculing himself, each other. It's just, like I say, weird and strange and unsettling. And that's what I picked up on. I think it is just, as soon as you analyse it, it's strange.
There's so much you could explore with it, really. I mean, you could do a great series, which is like the origin story of the guy. How did all these different personalities manifest themselves in little robot crime-fighting puppets?
I mean, there's something inherently gothic with a new noise has now appeared in the background on my microphone. Sorry about that. There's something inherently gothic about something like Dolman, the sense that is really plugging into the sinister nature of what's meant to be an entertaining, ventriloquism, puppets. They're meant to be cute, they're meant to be childlike, but it's just taking that and going, well, this is actually creepy in of itself, even outside of it, there being crime fighters kind of thing.
And Eric Bradbury's art was also really dark. There's real heavy shadows, and you open a page and they're nearly all black, aren't they? There's very little, white spaces in them.
And sometimes it looks almost Victorian. It's very hard to place in time the original strip because it's almost like his little backstreet shop looks like it's out of some, Dickens novel or something.
Yeah, definitely.
And then they'll go to a bit sort of modern bland or something. And again, sort of, when at the time I didn't really know it was Chris going to be drawing it, so it was a bit of a dear artist opening to it, and I just said, let's mix and match, let's have no particular era here, but strange little sort of things that almost clash chronologically speaking, or in terms of their anachronisms or the opposite in the setting. So it's definitely like how the strip was, I think.
It's quite good timing, really, because I've just discovered Talking Pictures TV channel. It's a TV channel that specialises in old black and white British 60s movies. So I've been watching tons of them lately. And so getting to draw a House of Dolman is just perfect timing, really, because my mind is totally in that place already.
Yeah, great Talking Pictures.
I mean, some of those films are pretty dark. I mean, we always assume that, old films didn't really tackle deep subjects, but they really did. I mean, they obviously did it in a more disguised way, but there's some very dark subject matters in those old films.
When you were asked to revisit the House of Dolman and in effect update, how much did you feel you did need to update, or because spoilers for anybody? I mean, no one's read it yet, apart from the editorial team and the creators involved. But if you don't want to hear this, then stop listening. But Dolman in this series is older. He's clearly time has moved on. Why, Simon? Why did you choose to make him older?
I think there were two things going on when I looked at House of Dolmann. First of all, there's that temptation to do what we did with The Vigilant and bring them, I suppose, more into a real or semi-real world, or update them, or give them that kind of Marvel Man, Miracle Man polish that Alan Moore did so well. But in the end, when I reread, I sat down with a pile of Valiants and just reread about 30 strips. And because it was so hard to place, I didn't feel I wanted to tamper too much with that. It lives in its own little bubble, so that I didn't try and connect it to The Vigilant or update it too much. But I did want an idea that things had changed. It wasn't just from that time, that there's been a passage of time. So we introduced this Superpowers Bureau that came in an early POW annual, and we look at, and it more like he's on their books now, Dolman, and he's got older, but of course the puppets haven't. So, but it also, there was a little story mechanism. I just wanted him slightly less involved in the action. In the original strips, he's very much doing the riding of the doll bike and out there in the field with the dolls. But I just thought it was more interesting and more weird if he's somewhere quite a way off and we explain it by remote viewing and radio control, but he's not in the thick of things. And again, without any spoilers, that feeds into a big sort of what the moment in the script itself, in the story.
And Chris, what about you? What were your inspirations for the art on this story?
I think to try and embrace the gothic aspects that we mentioned earlier. Like when I got to draw Dolman's shop, I did want, it was fun to draw, make it look all Victorianish, and put it in a cobbled street. I think pretty much to keep it as faithful as I could, really. Otherwise, there's it's like being it's like being in a band and getting to like a pub band and getting to play some of your favourite songs. Really, I see it a lot like that. It's a chance to play with the toys that I used to have when I was a kid. Really, so I had no great desire to change it at all. I tried to be as faithful as possible to the original drawings as I could. I tried to make everything look pretty old-fashioned. Whenever there's a telephone or a wheelchair, I made sure they look like old-fashioned telephones and wheelchairs. I did put a laptop in because there was one in the script, but I put it next to an old-fashioned mechanical typewriter as well. So it's up to the reader to decide when they think it's set.
With a project like this, obviously there's multiple other characters in the Smash special. How do you think you stop it being a nostalgia fest, particularly when it's being created by, or some of it's being created by people who grew up on this or picked up in reprint when they were younger? How do you stop it sliding into nostalgia and becoming something that doesn't necessarily appeal to someone who comes in cold to it?
I think for one thing, there are modern sensibilities now. We haven't gone for thought bubbles or anything very dated. It hopefully reads like a modern comic, and I'm sure Chris's art helps that immeasurably to make it look of the now rather than the then. But I think it was just better that we just played it straight. Within a weird setup, play it straight. Don't try and reinvent the wheel. And the net result is you get something, even if you're coming to it fresh, you'll understand it, you'll get it. It's a nicely done in one, I hope, little story. It's 6 pages, but I hope it's very much, if you've never read House of Dolman, you can just pick it up, read it, and you'll get the idea and maybe even want to read more.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much more you can do with those characters, because we didn't even get a chance to use them all, because he's got tons of these puppets, so we basically boiled it down to about 4 or 5, didn't we?
Yeah.
But there's tons more, each with their own skills and properties. If it's ever picked up as a ongoing series, there's loads of directions it could go in.
Because I guess it's a series which, like an awful lot of these, they are of their time, and yet they seem to be timeless. They're those characters that, and I can't remember who said it. You know, a character who endures can be summed up in a single sentence. You know, if you go into paragraphs and paragraphs, you can't necessarily see them lasting. But with Dolman, it's a creepy ventriloquist who has robotic dummies to commit crimes. Full stop.
Yeah. You know, I mean, the nice thing with Dolman is that it is that thing of they are fighting crime, and yet they're the weirdest things in it by far. You know, the criminals often aren't. You know, especially in the original strips, they were very, you know, sort of regular bank robbers and things like that. And the weird, creepy side of it was all coming from Dolman and the Dolls. So you know, it just played with your expectations all the time. You know, what should be comfortable and comforting is the thing that's weirding you out all the time with it.
I've got a question, actually. You know, the character, the mole, we don't really get to see much of him in our strip. He's the one with rotor blades instead of hands, and he can burrow through the earth. He really looks like the Black Sapper, who was a DC Thompson character, doesn't he? Or do you think that was deliberate?
I have no idea. You know, I don't know whether that was deliberate or just, you know, was it the same artist using a similar figure? But yeah,
Black Sapper, he also had a mole. He also had a burrowing, earth burrowing machine.
You know, I imagine they took their influences. Strange as we're pulling from all sorts of other things, modern reinterpretations.
It's interesting the direction that the editors have gone with this, because I don't know if you remember was it 94 Action Special?
Oh yeah,
Fleetway did, and then got a rap over the knuckles because they didn't actually own most of the characters. You know, you in there you've got writers like John Smith and Mark Miller, and
that went down well, didn't it?
Well, I'll be honest, I really, really enjoyed it at the time. I had no context for these characters whatsoever. You know, for example, you know, I know people think it was sacrilege, but I love what they did with the Spider. I love what they did with Curse to Doom and all this and the other. But that, as you say, that didn't go down necessarily very well, because it was, many people at the time thought it was taking these characters actually out of the things that made them good in the first place. Where's that line? Is it a fine line? Is it a blurry line? Is it a thick line between paying tribute and doing something different, and the other side, which is perhaps going too far and taking away the elements that people feel made them special in the first place?
Well, I mean, it's such a tough balancing act, this nostalgia versus the need to be not mired in the past by it. And you know, I mean, I think you've got to be, as always, respectful. And you know, it's no big deal for me because I love the characters, I love the way they were, so I'd hate to just sort of destroy what made them then. But you have got to push the envelope a little. The modern audience is much more, I think, demanding and analytical about what they're reading, and you know, obviously feedback is just so much more instantaneous. I think you've got to think, you know, push the nostalgia a little bit back in favor of just telling a proper, engaging story for someone who's coming across these characters for the first time.
So you both got to work on House of Dolman, and I know Chris's answer to this, because as soon as we acquired the archive from Egmont, I think I got one personal DM on Twitter. We got an email into work. I think Keith had a couple of emails basically saying, "Let me work on the Spider."
Oh yes.
And unfortunately, that went to someone else with this one. But Simon, are there characters from the archive that you look at, whether they're in this Smash special or not? You look at them and you think, I just would give anything to get my hands on them.
Yeah, I mean, but almost too many to list. With the first Vigilant, I convinced Keith to let me use Adam Eterno in it because I loved that strip. It was definitely one that I remember very fondly, and again had that weirdness to it of him just drifting in and out of situations, and so I mean, there's a list. I mean, I could be on here for another half an hour going through them, but obviously it's the classic ones. It's Robot Archie. I loved Robot Archie, and the Spider. Strangely, it didn't have that same impact on me back then, but I appreciate it much more now reading it again. Steel Claw's amazing. Yeah, but strangely, some of my favourite ones are the weirder ones. The Cursiter Dooms. There was a strip in line called White Eyes. There was a sort of gas that turned people into white-eyed superhumans, and or super villains. They were, definitely the bad guys. Plus the usual pair of plucky school kids chasing them. But it was dark, and it gripped me as a kid, and it may look a little more basic when you read it again now, but part of the fun of working on the Vigilant and now House of Dolman is I've got this inbuilt excuse just to de-archive all these old comics and sit and read them again, which has been fabulous.
There's the Guinea Pig was good fun, wasn't it? They reprinted a load of those in old 2000 AD annuals, and they were drawn by Brian Lewis. And he was basically this man who volunteered for bizarre scientific experiments. And there was like another evil wheelchair scientist who seemed to get a perverse delight out of making this guy's life as miserable as possible.
Sounds like a really depressing kind of Mac 1, or no, was it Death Wish?
Yeah.
He was always putting himself in harm's way, wasn't it? But that was quite thrilling. But the idea of him just kind of supinely kind of throwing himself at the mercy of science.
Yeah.
There's something about wheelchairs as well. The villain in White Eyes was in a wheelchair for at least part of the time. It's just like, oh dear, you can't really get away with that.
I mean, there's been quite a lot of academic work done on deformity as a symbol of negative behaviour, going all the way back into human history. You've only got to look at the Bond movies. They regularly disfigure their bad guys to show that it is an external expression of their internal wrongness, internal evil. So comics were definitely not immune to that in the
no
70s.
I mean, I suppose that's another thing slightly now, is that there is that onus to be more politically correct. I mean, I hate that phrase, but you have got to remember that we live in a very different world to the world in the late 60s, early 70s. So with the Vigilant, there was a conscious effort to make it more multicultural, more sort of gender broad. It just and I think you have to have that in mind these days when you're dealing with these characters from 40 plus years ago.
Well, a classic example is My Tech the Mighty, which is in this Smash special, and hopefully we're going to be talking to the creative team on that in a future episode. But you're entirely right. There are embedded attitudes in these strips that are unpalatable now, completely unpalatable, and quite rightly so. I kind of want to wrap this up a little bit, but just to get a sense from you about, I guess, and I've asked this question before. I think to Simon, the value of resurrecting these characters. The commercial realities that we as a publisher face mean that we can't fill the shelves full of new titles.
No.
Particularly not at the moment. And the Smash special isn't going into newsagents because of COVID. So I kind of want to get your feelings on being at the creative end of this process, about the value of resurrecting these characters when they can't necessarily put them back pride of place as they once were.
I'd be interested to know what the motivation behind Rebellion is to bringing back. Is it something that they're hoping to develop more? Is this like a pilot episode to a potential?
I mean, we'd love to, but like I said, the commercial realities are that it's just not feasible to put out new titles. You know,
no.
So it's I think it's more a case of, and you know, I realise I'm a company spokesman, but I don't necessarily want to speak for the entire company. That we're doing what we can with what we have.
Yeah.
You know, because there are so many great characters, and
but don't forget these characters are really popular in Europe as well. So you've got
absolutely
you've got a massive base. I mean, all those characters constantly stay in print in Europe, don't they?
Of course, Janice Stark continued being published in France long after it had been wound up in Britain. So
and so did Robert Archie.
Yeah,
there's a whole German series of Robert Archie, isn't there?
I mean, I think the important thing to me is showing, I suppose, the world that we have this heritage of characters. I mean, it's important to remember that, you know, everybody tends to think of the US characters or, you know, the European characters, but we have our own real sort of unique base of characters that I think say more about the British, you know, people than almost anything. You know, I think no other country necessarily would have come up with this set of characters. They're uniquely British often, you know, in the way that The Prisoner and the John Steed Avengers had that flavour that, you know, it's so uniquely British oddball that, you know, I don't think anything could have anybody come up with anything like that. So I think it's important to showcase these things and remind everybody that, you know, we've got this long history of British comic characters of if not exactly superheroes, superheroic characters in our own library.
Absolutely, and it's been fantastic to see, you know, with the Vigilant and with the Smash Special, and the Action Special, and all the other specials we've got coming out this year. These classic characters, guys. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat. Apologies for the noise going on behind me as I chat away. I'm constantly fearing that the floor is going to collapse out from underneath me, but. Yeah, no, I've been very lucky to be able to read the Smash Special as it's gone to press, and it's fantastic stuff. So thank you so much for that. If people want to find you online, where can they seek you out?
I'm always on Twitter.
Same here, Twitter, Facebook, and you know, we have our To the Death site as well. So you know, we're quite a big presence at the moment as we promote our own things.
Awesome. Right. Well, thanks again. And yeah, hopefully speak to you both again in the future.
Great. Thanks very much. Right, cheers. Take care.
Cheers, guys. Bye. Many thanks to Chris and to Simon for that lovely little chat. Thank you for them taking the time. Next up is Jarrod and MJ from Doomrocket. Like I said, Halo Jones is one of those absolute classic series. You know, when you're talking about the best characters 2000 AD has ever published, Halo Jones is right up there. Alan Moore, Ian Gibson, a series also that you can really get your teeth into. We're going to talk a little bit about the themes of it, the characters, the metaphors, so many metaphors, and what we think about the fact that it is technically unfinished and unlikely to ever be. So it was wonderful to chat to Jarrod and MJ. Like I said, no video on this. Thank you, Zoom. So we shall crack on with Deep Dive into the Ballad of Halo Jones. Tell people a bit about yourself, because you know we've known each other for a while, but tell us a little bit about your comics credentials, really.
I see. MJ, you want to start?
I guess my credentials are mostly on the retail end. I've been working in various Chicagoland comic shops for like 12 years now, for 5 different shops. And the shop I'm at right now, I've been at for like 4 years now. And that's G-Mark Comics in Logan Square. And then the one I was at before that was Challengers Comics, which is like a neighborhood away. It's very close. We won an Eisner while I was working there for the Will Eisner Spirit of Retailing Award. So that was a great shop, and my new shop is good too. I do miss Challengers a bunch. They were a wonderful shop. And Jarrod's been working at Gmart for a couple of years with me too.
Yeah, that's true.
And I've been writing for your website since we've been dating.
6 years.
Yeah. And then we've been doing this podcast for a few years now too.
Over 2 years now.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a long time. Yeah.
So that's it. And then I started reading comics, I don't know, comparatively late in life. I started in college. I was about 19. Jarrod though started when he was like a kid. So I don't have that kind of cred. But in the time that I have had to read comics, I've read a lot. Because I worked at Borders before I started working at comic shops, and we were able to check out the books that were stock. So I was able to read so much more than I would have been able to otherwise. So I was able to bone up real quick.
You're an authority in my life. I would say that as a comics reader. I would.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I don't know if I deserve it.
It's the truth.
But what about you?
Well, I mean, yes, I've been reading comics practically all my life, at least since I was 6 or 7. But as far as being in the comics game, I suppose I started Doomrocket in 2013. It was going to be a film site, Mike. I moved to Chicago to write for film. And then I just kind of accidentally fell backwards into, well, comics. And then all of a sudden, before I knew it, people wanted to write for me, and we assembled a team.
You pushed it pretty hard, and it's a quality site. So
it's fine. We're on a monthly schedule now, which is great because we can focus on the podcast, which is Casual Wednesdays. Every single week. And that's been kind of what I've been focusing on a lot lately. We also dabble in writing too.
Yeah.
I.
We've both I've got a short story coming out in the Insider Art Anthology that's going to be helping women and non-binary retailers suffering from the coronavirus downturn.
It is true.
Which is super cool. And then I wrote an issue of Gene Ha's comic May last year, issue number 9, and then I co-wrote issue 10 with him. So that's pretty cool. And then Jarrod did some writing too.
Shelley Bond put together an anthology, Hey Amateur. I'm sure you heard about it. A whole bunch of folks got to be a part of it, and she asked me to do it too. I don't know why. I still don't know why. She never gave me an adequate reason, but I ended up doing a strip with this artist named Christian Rossi, and Hey Amateur being a how-to guide in 9 easy steps about to do a thing. And since I have zero expertise in anything at all, I decided to make it up. We were watching DS9 one night, and somebody hopped into a spaceship, and they were like, "You know how to fly this thing?" And I was like, "Jesus, that's like in everything." So I taught people how to fly this thing. But that's it. Yeah, that's our comic background.
Yeah.
Excellent. So you've when we were setting this up, I said, what would you like to do a deep dive on? And one of the comics you mentioned was Halo Jones. Do you want to explain a little bit about why you've chosen to do a deep dive onto Halo Jones? Because anybody who's read it, I'm sure, wouldn't need an explanation. But what was your reasoning behind choosing this to dive into?
Well, for me, it was really hard when you asked. I was like, geez, where do I even start? But then I was like, well, I'll just start where I began. Halo Jones was my introduction to 2000 AD, as I'm sure it has been for a lot of readers. Mainly because, Mr. Alan Moore. But when I first read it, I had no idea what 2000 AD was. I mean, I was a kid growing up in Michigan, and, the comic book stores we have over there are pretty dope, but we didn't have too many progs lying around. But they did have collections of Halo Jones, the black and white collections. And that's Cooper, that's our cat. And so when I first read it, it left this really big impression on me because I had just come off of reading other works by Moore. Watchmen, obviously, and a few others. But Halo Jones was so different, and it had this different kind of flavor to it, and it left a mark on me. And so when I did grow a little older and my world expanded a bit in comics, and I had a better understanding of what British comics could be, I attribute Halo Jones for my entry port. And Cooper agrees. Thanks, Coop.
We might have to put him in the other room if he keeps that up.
At some point, yeah.
What about you, MJ?
My introduction to Halo Jones was when I was in the Valkyries. You were promoting the. I'm wearing the T-shirt that you sent us all. You were promoting the reprints of this, and you sent a bunch of us the first volume and the shirt. And I had never read it before, and it's so excellent, and it's just a really good memory of that time being in that group, and honestly being friends with you. So I have personal happy thoughts that are. I have personal happy thoughts that just.
It's all your fault, Mike.
Oh yeah, it's usually my fault. I mean, just to explain to people that don't know what the Valkyries were. I guess they were like a group of people who worked in comic book stores, really, wasn't it?
Yeah. It was just pretty much ladies who work in comic shops. So it was kind of a support group / retailer group. It disbanded a few years ago, and there are lots of other retailer groups nowadays to kind of fill that gap. But I miss all the people I met through it. It was a great group in that respect. But also, like, other than just those happy memories I have associated. Other than those happy memories I have associated with this book, it's just such a phenomenal book, and the fact that it doesn't really end is it's frustrating, but it's also another reason to love it because it lets you kind of go wherever you want to with whatever the ending was intended to be. It leaves an impression because of that open-endedness.
Well, we'll move on to the end or otherwise of Halo Jones later on. But first, I mean, let's dive into the first book, because one criticism I've seen of Halo Jones, particularly from people who aren't necessarily au fait with Moore's work, is it's actually quite a difficult proposition because you're dealing with an awful lot of slang, an awful lot of very, very sudden, quick world building. I mean, what was your experience of diving into that world and the kind of the onslaught of information that you were given?
Well, I think one of the strengths of Halo Jones is that it does throw you into the deep end. So its world building is already occurred in a sense. You're thrown into the hoop, and you have no idea what the hoop is, but it has these things that you can attach yourself to. Again, growing up in Michigan as a kid, it was kind of a strange thing because you have no context for like what something this extreme could be. But, you know, the style and the energy of Halo and her friends, that's recognizable. And then, of course, their vernacular, the little bits of slang that Moore just comes up with out of nowhere that just seems like gobbledygook, but it makes sense in context, especially on rereads. You come to appreciate it. The world itself will wait. It'll keep while you become attached to the characters and get your bearings with the story.
And it's very interesting as you go further into the series how your context on that first volume changes when you learn more about that world because you weren't told it at the beginning. So you kind of had these assumptions, and then you learn later, oh, I didn't realize that the hoop was nothing. It was a slum,
yeah.
And that no one there had. You could kind of see that no one had jobs, but when it's communicated like that,
or worse, they were there just to work for the hoop.
Yes, yeah. It kind of because like. A lot of that story is very, I don't know, it's a lot brighter than the later volumes become. And reading that further context makes, gives it that different light. And it makes you kind of rethink the whole thing. It's like, oh, this seemed like a, this bubbly little adventure with these gals. And then it's like, oh, wait, no, this is a lot sadder than it first seemed.
And that's the function of Halo Jones, isn't it? I mean, it was supposed to be an antidote to the guys and the guns and all the concrete and the cordite that you would find in Mega City 1. It was something different. It offered a female character that wasn't, window dressing or just a simple part of the plot to progress a male character's agenda. Halo was a very real person.
And she wasn't like a stand-in for a male character. Like a lot of times people will write lady characters and they'll just pretty much be a male character. They'll just look like a lady. Halo actually feels like a girl. She has lady interests. She hangs out with her lady friends. The lady friendships in this book make me so happy because it's not very often that you see women that get to have positive functional friendships, especially in comics.
I wanted to ask, what did you think about the inciting incident occurring because they decided to go out shopping?
That's great.
Too tropey?
No.
Okay, all right.
Because, and honestly, it felt it felt very now having to worry about going to go grocery shopping, having to make all of these ludicrous plans just to figure out, okay, well, we have to go here and here, because that's what you have to do now, and you have to make sure you got your mask with you, and you got to make out your grocery list plan and make sure you pick up everything, because if you don't, it's like, well, I can't go back to the grocery store now. I'm not supposed to leave the house.
Instead of avoiding the different drummers, you avoid people without masks.
Yeah. It's like, oh God, I got a social distance. Stop getting within 6 feet.
One thing I'm really interested in is your view as Americans on the fact that the Hoop is it's floating off the coast of Manhattan, because so many strips in 2000 AD are set in America, are parodying America, are extrapolating outwards from America. And personally, when I was reading it for the first time, if it hadn't have said Manhattan, I wouldn't necessarily have twigged that it was actually a location other than kind of generic Earth. I wondered whether you both felt there wasn't an America there that you recognised, or whether it was just it's British people viewing America through their lens.
I didn't. I assumed it was supposed to be set somewhere British, just because I knew it was a British comic written by a Brit.
Yeah.
It wasn't until they established, like, oh, this is off the coast of Manhattan. I didn't realize it, and the fact that they're using like future slang, kind of it's not recognizable slang to us, so I can't say, oh, that's a Britishism. It doesn't, or that's an Americanism. So it's harder to suss out when it takes place in the future like that.
Well, for me, there's things that you can latch onto that you pick up on. It's not necessarily a Brit's view of what us Yanks are up to, but like people go to shows. There's a band that everyone likes. There's a culture that everyone is pretty much mired in. Kind of a zeitgeist that's not dissimilar to what was going on in the 80s at the time. I mean, I was a baby at that time, but I presume that a lot of people were going to punk shows in the early 80s and such, and that's kind of what you get in Halo Jones, and that's what people were doing in New York especially.
So I'm thinking in terms of that world building, in terms of that zeitgeist that you were launched into, it feels almost designed to be overwhelming. To a certain extent, I think Halo Jones is one of those strips where actually the concept of future shock, so that the idea that the future is so overwhelming that it induces some kind of psychosis in human beings. I always get that sense far more from Halo Jones than I do necessarily from some Judge Dredd strips.
I enjoy science fiction that does that, though. Like I want complete immersion,
right.
Because you're gonna pick it up, and it's fun to figure it all out.
It's like
at the onset like that. Yeah. You're learning how to have your brain live in this world, and it's. I like that. I like that. What in media res opening?
Yeah,
yeah,
it's great. A lot of sci-fi tends to do this, where they're just like, in you go, and best of luck, and you either learn how to swim or you don't. Mm-hmm. And with Halo Jones, it's easy to do because Halo's such a great character. I mean, there's no pretense to her. She wakes up in the morning, she doesn't have any money, life kind of sucks, but she has her friends, and that's relatable.
Yeah,
and
she's a very real, very normal person.
Yeah.
And it's fun to see that in this world that is so insane and crazy.
Yeah.
There's this, one normal gal that you can super totally relate to.
But it's so crazy, too, because before you know it, the world's expanding right under your feet. Like, there's little news items, news bits about a big war on tarantula, and you're like, what the hell's a tarantula? Like a giant spider? What does that even mean? You don't pay attention to it because it's just window dressing. But at the same time, it comes to be a matter of consequence later in the story, and it happens so seamlessly that you don't even realize it's happening until it's happened.
You can, for me, you can really see the writer of Watchmen in Halo Jones. Halo Jones is my favorite of Moore's work, but you see that kind of multi-layered storytelling where they are slipping in references to things that get picked up on later, and there's things happening in the background and everything. And the coming back to what you were saying, MJ, the sheer ordinariness, if you will, of her life, even the smallest things all of a sudden kind of take on an extreme nature. You know, a shopping trip becomes a matter of life and death.
Yeah, it's cool to see that, because like I said, nowadays that feels very relevant.
Well, it's also, the peril isn't overwhelming at first. It's a substantial thing, like you're beefing with neighborhood toughs.
Oh yeah, at the beginning, it like I said, the first volume starts to feel like this, more of a romp, and it just gets a little darker as you go on, and darker and darker, and then the next book, and then the next book.
Let's talk about the second book for a second, because in terms of getting darker, Ian Gibson gave an interview a while back, I forget with whom, but he mentioned that editors wanted Halo to have a little more violence in the strip for the second book. And so if you want to know why there's so much damn blood and a crazy metal dog, all of a sudden it's like that's why. And the second book's the one that I find the most trying. There are some wonderful chapters in that strip, but when Toby the dog decides that he's got a crush on Halo and he's just gonna kill for love, I'm like, how did we get here? Was this necessary?
That one was maybe my least favorite twist.
Yeah. It felt so odd because it stems off the first book too. So it feels like, well, one, it's a natural progression in a way because you're still continuing with these characters. But then Toby, something goes wrong with his memory spools and he decides that he has bloodlust now. I don't know.
I think there's something wonderfully, I don't know, now something wonderfully quaint about the desire to escape on a space line, to essentially become a stewardess on an airplane. But it's that theme of getting out runs through this, like Letter Through a Stick of Rock, and you see its appearance constantly as things go on. How much do you think that is natural to the progress of the strip, and how much do you think it's are there moments that you feel in any way that's been shoehorned, or was it there from the beginning?
Oh, it was there from the beginning.
Yeah, I think it works perfectly as a theme for the story. It's just, it seems so innate.
Halo is a character that, she's going with the flow for the most part, but there is a yearning. That yearning exists in everybody. Everybody looks out the window every once in a while when their job's not going so well, or if they're in the middle of a pandemic or whatever, and wonder, what's out there? What's beyond this? Can I pick up and just go over there? That would sure be nice. And I think it's interesting because at the end of books 2 and 3, the word out is used explicitly. The last word of Halo Jones is out. And it's not necessarily an exploration of space, it's an exploration of self. And Halo's finding out who she is, and she's not doing it deterministically. She's doing it as she goes along.
I think it's interesting you say exploration of space, because I think it's also an exploration of her own space, because so many of these volumes involve her being enclosed, because when she's in the hoop, she's enclosed in the hoop. When she's on the
Clara Pandy.
I almost said Cara. When she's on the ship, it's also very enclosed. And then in the third volume, when they're on the warfront, they're in those
giant suits,
big enclosed suits in the Crush. So yeah, every single volume, she has something she wants to escape from and can and does.
And can I say as an aside, the Clara Pandy, it's easy to want to escape when you have a ship that looks that gorgeous.
Oh, it's a beautiful ship.
It's one of my all-time favorite spaceships of any medium. It's perfect.
So is the final ship in the story that she ends up leaving on.
Yeah.
They're also beautiful. They're just very
Ian
they're very
Gibson,
Art
man.
Nouveau and like because the Clarapandy looks like a swan. I love them. I think all spaceships should look like that from
It's
here
a
on
silver
out.
goose.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
It's something that Ian Gibson does incredibly well. I mean, I don't know if you guys have read the Robo Hunter stuff.
Oh yeah, I have not.
There you go. The designs from that. I mean, you know, I read that when I was a kid, and my God, I loved all from the tiniest little robots in Verdus all the way up to like the kind of massive city block destroying ones. There's an innate realness to his art. Like even when it's exaggerated and it's comedic, there's still a solidity to it, which is offset by almost a lightness of touch. You know, you look at something like the Clarapandy, and that design, you can feel the weight of that ship, and yet it is just floating in the air. You know, as if it weighs absolutely nothing, and that's a remarkable trick to pull off. I can't think of many other artists that are able to do that, really.
Ships are often so over-designed. Character costumes are so over-designed. It's so easy to do, to just fall down that well and overthink the world, overthink the structures of that world. But there's a slickness, a sleekness, and a minimalism to Halo Jones, even on the hoop. Because everyone looks like they're wearing a bunch of like garbage bags and like, you know, duct tape around their costumes, but
Lots of layers.
But there's a functionality to it in a fashion that that just so, I hate using the word effortless when I'm talking about art, but when you're talking about fashion, you can get away with it. So in this context, Gibson makes the fashion of Halo Jones look effortless.
I think also Barbara Nascenzo's colors on the newer editions, they're so good and they match his art so well.
It maximizes it.
Yeah, especially on with textures on things like the ships, but also textures with the fabrics and the clothes. Yeah.
It's really surreal. I'm usually really resistant to coloring jobs on traditional black and white comics. Like if it's established, printed, and been around for years as black and white, leave it be. But there's something about what Barbara Nascenzo brought to the reprintings. One, it gives me a chance to read it again. But two, it gives you a chance to experience it somewhat differently. I mean, it doesn't change the story at all, but it does add this warmth to it.
Yeah,
like
a certain depth.
Yeah, the Clarapandy gleams. Halo has rose to her cheeks. I always pictured Rhodas to have brown hair. She had black hair, and that just it doesn't change the character for me.
Wait, let's talk about the colored one for a little bit, because to be honest with you, Jarrod, I was of a similar mind to you on colouring black and white artwork, just because 2000 AD series have been poorly served with post-publication colouring, because you have the terrible oxymoronic quality comics. The Eagle reprint. I mean, even the colour in the Eagle reprints wasn't fantastic. And I've seen some really real hack jobs, but there is, as you say, there is something about the way that Barbara Nascenzo coloured this that it's sympathetic, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think when you change one thing about a story that you've read again and again, it's an opportunity to explore the space yourself. For Halo Jones, I mean, it's in context, it's the saddest damn story, one of the saddest damn stories I've ever read, but there's an energy to it too. And that energy was served by the black and white. It felt very, forgive me for using this, punk. It felt like it was on this bleeding edge of something else you hadn't tried before. So when Nascenzo comes in with these colors, it doesn't dull the edges at all, but it does add a glow and a warmth to it that makes it somewhat more melancholy. Reading it again for this podcast, I came to the last page, and you know the bit where she abdicates the love of, snake ear guy and decides to abscond with herself out into space to who knows where And it's just the look on her face that Gibson gives Halo was one thing, but when Barbara Nocenzo added color to her face, I don't know, it hit harder. It landed differently, and it makes me wistful just to think about it, actually.
I mean, that's one of my all-time favorite moments in comics is just where she turns to him and is incredibly real. Just gets such a sense of the weight of everything that has happened to her and the journey that you've been on with her. And when she's incredibly real and incredibly honest in that moment. And on that basis, I want to talk a little bit about female characters and how comics treat female characters, and not just that, but also how comics treat characters in general. Because so many comics are about the punches, they're about the big moments, they're about action. But Halo Jones is a character with a sense of depth that I is so rare in comics. I want to get your perspectives on her as a person, I guess.
Well, as a person, Halo means to me what Hopi means to me from Love and Rockets. To me, these are two characters that rent space in my mind. Like, I think about them sometimes, like they're friends. And that is rare. I mean, I don't know if you know this, Mike, but I like Superman. But Superman is not... Yeah, I know. But Superman is a character that occupies my mind in a different way. It's the iconography and what he stands for. It depends on who's writing him at the time. Every once in a while, a writer will get it, and it'll stand out in my mind. But Halo Jones is a character that, even though you spend a very brief amount of time with her, and my God, would I kill to see the extra books that were never to be, but that we end on such a note, that final panel that you were talking about, it brings everything back around, and it makes you reflect on where she was as a person, and you realize that you've been with her this entire way. That's kind of the power of what Alan Moore can do. When he is firing on all cylinders, he can make you just lose yourself when you're reading his characters, and then he'll hit you with a punch at the end, and then you're just basking in the afterglow of a story well told. And that's the power of Halo. But MJ, we just got done reading an event comic for our podcast. Oh God,
we just got done reading 0 Hour.
Beautiful event, beautifully illustrated. But
talk about focusing on the punching.
The female characters they're just not there. They're treated so shabbily.
Yeah, the one female character, which is like an alternate universe version of Batgirl, who is given kind of like, I don't know, she's utilized the most out of all of the ladies. They kill her at the end, and then her whole universe disappears.
But
so
do they though? Yeah.
Yeah. But ostensibly, she sacrifices herself to save Damage.
Yeah, that's true.
And it's just such a bummer to see so much of that in superhero comics, and Halo doesn't do that, at least. But as far as Halo and just like characters in general, especially regarding superhero comics, she's not really a superhero, obviously, but we don't really get to see superheroes change that often. And the great thing about Halo Jones is that we see her change so much. And it's only like, 3 books worth of comics, but she grows up and we grow up with her. I love to be able to see that because the character growth is just mwah. And yeah, to have it done on a female character is pretty refreshing because you don't see that very often. There's also, like I mentioned, like the female friendships. Seeing her have such positive interactions with all these different ladies. Because usually, ladies in superhero comics, there's a token girl on the JLA. Up until recently, they've gotten better. But, sorry, I'm saying too much.
No, you're fine.
Being able to see her interacting with so many ladies is just, like I said, it's refreshing. And more comics should do that.
I feel like once you venture outside, get out of the umbrella of DC and Marvel, you start to venture into more introspective comics. I mean, you don't fall into them easily, But if you have a guide like, say, Alan Moore, who did have that cross company appeal, if you go backwards into his bibliography, you will come across stuff like Halo Jones. Like, if you were to read Strange Tales, like that anthology series that Marvel put out, and you discovered somebody named Gilbert Hernandez, and you loved his art, and you wanted to go backwards, guess what? You were in for a treat. You're falling into Palomar, of all places, and you'll never want to leave. So there is a guiding hand in comics. I always say that the cobblestones of comics always lead to the same place: your enjoyment. Because if you just stay on the road long enough, you're going to come through a lot of chaff, but every once in a while you'll come across something that handles characters, specifically female characters, with a little grace, dare I say a little ingenuity.
I wouldn't say Mr. Moore always does that, but
not so much.
Well, I mean, this is one of the difficulties of looking at a career, particularly of a writer, that's gone on for so long. You know, he started his big break, really, let's face it, was at 2000 AD, and from there he very rapidly went on to write some pretty industry medium defining stories.
Yeah.
But there's going to be inconsistency there. There's going to be missteps along the way, and I think particularly with there's quite a lot of critics who have a lot to say about Alan's relationship with female characters, but then you look at Halo Jones, and it's so tone perfect. It's almost
it is
flash.
Yeah. I as far as reading comics, I've read the other bits that Mr. Moore has written that haven't treated their ladies as well. And to read this after having read those, it's like, wow, I guess maybe I should change my opinion on how he tends to write ladies, because like this he wrote this before he wrote any of those, and yet the perspective on it is so different. Okay.
Yep. Don't want to blast out your audio there.
I'm sorry. Usually I'm talking too quietly, so.
Keep going. You're doing great.
Oh, I kind of lost my train of thought.
Oh. Well, you read something like Halo Jones, and then you remember that Killing Joke happened, and you can remember that, yes, like Mike said, if a writer goes on for too long, you're going to have that spectrum. Nobody's writing a perfect story 100% of the time.
Yeah.
There is an extremity to this polarity between something like what happened to Barbara Gordon in The Killing Joke and how deftly Halo Jones is handled in her own strip. It allows you to explore the space of the writer and what he's providing you, but it also allows you to interrogate your own feelings about how characters are handled in comics and what your limits are. You can appreciate Killing Joke for the wonderful art by Mr. Bolland. Great thrillcast, by the way, with Bolland, but that was very, very insightful. But then also you can draw a line in the sand and say, no, this is not for me, or no, this doesn't work for me.
Yeah. This one, Halo Jones, super does though.
I'd recommend
Super
it to
works.
anybody. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned The Killing Joke, because one of the things that came out of the chat with Brian and things that Brian said online is that he always got the sense that and it's something that Alan has also said since, actually he doesn't really like The Killing Joke. It's not a favorite. It's not a career highlight for him.
Right.
That's a lot of what I've read too.
If based on what Brian said, if anything, Alan kind of tried to pull out of it when he didn't feel it was working. But I think it's really interesting because they were written not very far apart. You're only talking a matter of a few years. But I think that there is a theme in which they're quite common, which is something of an anathema to superhero comics, but can go very wrong, which is the notion that death is not the worst thing that can happen to you.
Yeah.
And with The Killing Joke, it's nasty. It's smarter people than I have written acres of criticism of that series. But with Halo Jones, I think actually it's handled in such a great way, because terrible things happen. She loses her best friend
Violently, yeah.
to the war. well, the war in lots of different ways. She effectively has suffers from PTSD and has a breakdown. All things which I guess in a mainstream comic necessarily would reduce her as a woman, and yet the third book sees her falling in love.
Yeah.
And undergoing effectively a romance, and being an object of desire and desiring, and that's a really difficult trick to pull off, to reduce something down like that, but then actually to kind of bring it back up and have it shinier and new than ever, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, that's another thing that I enjoyed, is that this isn't like a character that feels gender neutral. Like a lot of action pieces will have lady characters that just feel like men in women's bodies, and this still feels like a woman. It still feels like a woman's story, and that's I appreciate that.
It definitely I think about its own gender politics when I think about the character Glyph. Now, Glyph is a challenging character for a couple of reasons. And a lot of people seem to really react to Glyph. When I talk about Halo Jones, usually that's one character that gets brought up in the conversation, because Glyph is a character that changed sex and then changed it back and then changed it back. Just couldn't decide where they lied in terms of that. And then did it so often that they became a non-entity. They share space with Halo and Radis, and they're like, hey, we have a roommate? Tell us who you are. There's a whole chapter where they're like, oh, yeah, there you are. Tell us your life story. And Glyph goes into this whole story explaining in detail about who they are and where they came from. And by the end of their story, Halo and Radis have moved on to a soap opera.
Yeah.
And it's heartbreaking because Glyph is a person like Halo and has just as much value, but is treated as an afterthought. But it's done deliberately, too. It's done deliberately, too, so you have to wonder where exactly Moore was going with that concept. Would we see Glyph again in future books? Or would Halo come across a character like Glyph, and then she would have an epiphany and go, oh my god, I had a roommate named Glyph. Like, we don't know.
Glyph sacrificed himself at one point in the second story,
That's
saving her and Toy from Toby.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like, what is the meaning of Glyph to Halo in terms of Halo's own personal journey, as opposed to somebody that helps Halo get to where she needs to be? And that's kind of the line that a lot of comic books have a tricky time to navigate. It's, what is the functionality of your character? Who are they? What do they mean to themselves? And what do they mean to the world? And the functionality part is where a lot of people get tripped up, I think. It's like, are you just a plot device? Are you a source of humor and derision? Or are you a natural part of the character, or a natural part of the story as a character? And it's a really tough line to walk.
Yeah, looking at a character like Glyph in the context of the 1970s, it's a sci-fi concept. The idea of switching genders back and forth. But now, I know that Leah, Alan's daughter, has found that by talking to people who are trans and have gender dysmorphia, and they find that character very, very difficult, because you're right, they disappear. They do it so many times, they become effectively meaningless in the context of the society which they're in. So that is one of the really challenging bits of Halo is that even as you have a female character that feels so rounded and so grounded and ordinary and has a depth to them, at the same time you've also got quite dated concepts that perhaps are difficult to do now. Do you think that gets in the way of Halo Jones, that you're reading it now rather than 30, 40 years ago, or do you think that is something that I guess people have to look at and think about on their own terms?
Yeah, I would say the latter. It's definitely a part that made me kind of pause in the reading of the book, and it's like I don't know if this character needs to be the one that everyone forgets and glosses over, and
Well, I think the thing that we need to focus on is that Glyph is not an anachronism. Glyph is a character. So yes, the portion of Glyph's story in Halo Jones is definitely a reflection of its time, and you do have to look at that as you would any other story that takes place or was written in a separate time, and where attitudes have shifted or hadn't shifted to where they are today. You either embrace it as a part of the narrative or you challenge it. And you challenge it and you prop it up against the whole of the work and see if it's actually a benefit to it or if it's not. And again, book 2 is definitely a tough one to get through, but I think the Glyph chapter specifically is another one where I have to be like, I love this strip with all my heart, but it is not without its flaws. And I think the treatment of the Glyph character is definitely a flaw.
Let's go back to talking about Toby, because I find Toby an interesting character, not necessarily because of, as you say, the kind of weird personality switch that becomes part of the plot in book 2, but the notion of the guard dog, the male guard dog in a group of female characters, and what Moore is trying to say about kind of, I don't know, aggressive masculinity. He's kind of reduced the one male character down to an attack dog.
And a robot at that.
There's that bit where Toby comes up on that captain that Halo kind of has a bit of a crush on, and he says, "Oh, your Halo's dog. Did she get the memory spools that I gave her because she wanted to listen to him?" And he's like, "If you gave what?" He gets up on his hind legs quite literally and shoves them against the wall, and he's like, "I will chew your brain into mush" or something. But it's actually a dire indicator of things to come in terms of that character. And in terms of masculinity, and I guess he's embedded from the very beginning. He's part of Halo's life. But it turns out that a lot of folk end up having crushes on Halo in spite of themselves. Like, we find out poor Toy, at the end of her life, had this big old crush on Halo, and she never mentioned it. And it's not alluded to at all in the strip. I think Gibson once said in an interview that he wished he had known that Moore was coming out with that little twist towards her end, because he would have put something in the body language to imply that Toy had a crush on Halo. But with Toby, he's a metal dog. How the hell are you supposed to know that he's fostering these really intense emotions? You don't. And then it just kind of blindsides you with this violence. And when you find out what happened to poor Brenna, my God.
I think there's something in the first book where someone says something about Toby being a little extra fond of Halo, and I mean, he definitely didn't like Radice. They had a very antagonistic relationship.
Well, Radice was very antagonistic in general. Yeah. Like, there's that bit where Halo's writing a letter home to Rhodus, and she's talking about Toy, and she's like, she's really take charge, and like, we were out one night and she shoves a guy against the wall and you would hate her. And that was pretty funny.
I like Toy.
Toy was my favorite character aside from Halo.
Yeah.
I mean, I kind of like the idea of an attraction being there that's never alluded to, that's never mentioned, because one of the aspects that I love about Halo as a character is actually how blind she is to others. You know, she has empathy. She's able to love. She's able to have deep, meaningful friendships. But at the same time, there's to a degree a blindness to her. She's got her eyes fixed so firmly on the horizon, to getting out, to moving on, to being something else, that she kind of misses what's under her own nose. So, and that manifests itself, as you say, in two very different ways: from the robot dog and a friend at the same time. You know, so it's that kind of, yeah. It's a subplot that's barely even a subplot. It's like a subplot.
It's in there, but it's affecting.
Let's talk about the themes of the second and third books, because, as you say, the second book feels more difficult. It's like the classic difficult second album kind of thing. Do you see the second and third book as a kind of a bit of a roller coaster, or do they fit together nicely? Do you get the sense that there was a direction that Moore was moving in?
Oh, definitely. So yeah, this goes back to what I was talking about with that Gibson interview, is that the success of Halo Jones meant more people were going to read the strip. He mentioned that the editors wanted more bloodshed or action, I suppose. So I suppose that's where the tonal shift came from, and Moore, looking to appease editors, probably made it work to the best visibility. I can't say, but the tonal shift to it doesn't eclipse the first chapter of book 2, which does so much work to expand. Like, it's unexpected, this first chapter. It comes out of nowhere. It's even treated as a prologue, where a professor from the far-flung future is teaching a class about Halo Jones, the legend of Halo Jones, the Ballad of Halo Jones. And you're like, wait a second, the same one from before? What happens next? That's the only question in your mind when you finish that chapter. What could possibly happen to elevate Halo Jones to the strata? Book 3 builds on that magnificently because it does expand its scope, but it also drops Halo in a situation that you do not want for her. You want her to be happy. You want her to succeed in whatever endeavors she's seeking out to do, but this war is on. And she's stuck in an outpost, and Toy rescues her and says, come join the war effort, and we'll figure it out from there. And it's the worst possible situation. A planet with gravity so dense, it bends light. It bends time. You have no hope for survival on something like that. And so you start to clench up when you read it. And then you start to get a sense of what that professor was on about. Her sense of endurance, her own sense of empathy for other people, it really comes out in that third book.
Yeah, I didn't mind the tonal shift, and I enjoyed that prologue chapter of book 2
so
very
good.
much. Yeah,
it's so good.
It felt like it worked. I didn't have any like, this feels weird. It felt different, but it didn't feel like it didn't fit. But
well, you always feel kind of gross when you're watching an R-rated movie and something gnarly happens to a human being, right? Like, your sense of empathy goes into play. Like, if you watch a David Fincher movie and somebody's going to get hurt, like you watch Zodiac, for example, you know what you're getting yourself into, but when you actually see people getting hurt, I mean, this is an extreme example, your mind goes to a dark place, your mood does tamp down a bit. And that's kind of what happened for me in book 2. It's like, this is a wonderful world with its own set of dilemmas for Halo, but Alan Moore being Alan Moore, he is going, like, the thresher is on and Halo is about to enter it. You just have to prepare yourself mentally for it.
I felt more of that in book 3.
Yeah,
because it's a war zone. It's obviously going to be
for
a lot
sure,
grimmer. Yeah. But I enjoyed the increased science aspect of that volume, because you can tell that he really did some research on the effects that a high gravity planet would have that was that big, and it felt like really good military sci-fi, and I was delightfully surprised at that tone change.
Yeah.
And really, really liked it.
Spare a thought for Ian Gibson. I mean, we have a copy of an Alan Moore script that he wrote for Gene Ha for Top 10 that Gene gifted us, and it's just blocks of text for each panel. So I can't even imagine what he gave Gibson for that planet.
I think one of the Halo Jones books in here reprints one of his scripts, and it's done like, I don't know if they just redid the font for the reprint, but it's like old-timey typewriter font. Very that would be hard to read. That would be hard to read.
It was a different time.
And I have to going back to refer to it.
Having to leaf through actual paper, can you imagine?
Right.
As you say, a very different time. Very different time. I mean, you when talking about Moab, the high gravity planet, perfect opportunity to talk about metaphor in Halo Jones, because it is absolutely saturated with it. We've already talked about the Clara Pandy, which is like I said, light and hangs in the air and is a symbol of escape and the future and everything. Moab is the opposite of that. It is every dark part of your psyche absolutely weighing you down as you move through life. I want to get your perspective on that and how well it works on the page.
I think you hit the nail on the head, Mike. It's you're in a place. We have all been in a place where we have felt held down by something. Work, love, life. I mean, it's an oppressive feeling. Depression is it's just everywhere in your life when you have it. And Moab is, yes, dripping with metaphor. You are quite literally being pinned to the ground, and the only thing that can hold you up is something that you don't necessarily want to be a part of. She's fighting a war that she's not really. It reminds me of Martha Washington Goes to War, that Miller did with Gibbons, where and they go in similar trajectories too, where Martha and Halo, cultural differences aside, start at very meager beginnings and then ascend, in a sense, towards a war they never wanted and then become a very integral part of it. But when Halo has wanted that sense of escape, she is now again trapped. And not only is she trapped, she's with Toy, and she wants to take care of her friends. She also endears herself to a few other of her fellow soldiers, and now these are further attachments that will hold her to a certain position instead of going out to whatever end.
I enjoy that the Clara Pandy, like you said, it's very light. It's very streamlined, beautiful. Its look is very feminine. And then when you get to Moab, it's not at all.
Very utilitarian.
Yeah, it's still a very very like soft design. Most everything has very soft design to it, and that could be considered feminine. But just the the militaristic design kind of negates that.
Yeah.
And again, Barbara Nasenzo's coloring makes it warm, but also very forbidding, very uncomfortable looking.
What do you think that does for Halo?
Well, this is just another catastrophe she has to work through, and that we have to work through with her and experience with her. And seeing it being that forbidding makes it, that more difficult for us to go through with her.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Because you coming back to what we were saying about Toby being the only male character in that friendship group at the beginning. When you get to Moab, most of the men are these mindless, kind of genetically enhanced thugs who just, I mean, it couldn't be more obvious. It's barely even metaphor. He's just kind of just says it on the page.
And they barely show up. It's all the ladies.
The thing with Moab for me is, as you say, it's not feminine. It's inherently masculine. It's a number one. It's a war zone, so everything is militaristic. Everything is squat and flat and unpleasant.
The gravity suits they have to wear do have a little bit of a phallic look to the heads on them.
What, just a little?
You see that, and it's like, oh, that's funny. That's an interesting design.
Okay.
I mean, they walk around with one nipple that will kill you,
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but it's I really like the fact that Moore chose the cult, the colonists. They all follow a religion based on Lot's wife from the Old Testament. I mean, that again, that Metal didn't write it across the page about Halo as somebody who is held back by the past, is held back by her past, by her relation. Feels she's held back by relationships that are weighing her down, and for me, that's nicely echoed in the final pages as the ship leaves. there's that metaphor that played out before in her dreams about spiders and about a web and the web breaking and her getting out, and it's so rich in metaphor. It's almost a strip that's saturated by it, don't you think?
Mm-hmm. It's very well done. I don't think it's I feel that it's subtly woven in there, and
I mean, it's a dream, right? I mean, dreams are supposed to be interpretive, but it's not. I mean, I would say
no. I just mean all of it. Yeah, I don't mean just the dream sequence. I mean, just like the metaphor, like you mentioned with Lot's wife.
Right.
I think that whole bit is very, very just really good subtext just woven in there. I think that third volume you really see Moore coming into his own as the legend we know him to be, and it's pretty flawless in that respect.
It makes you wonder. I mean, everyone speculates about what happens next, and of course, poor Ian Gibson, whenever he shows his face in public, that's probably one of the first questions that comes up.
It should be the first question Alan Moore gets.
Well, there was this documentary about 2000 AD. I think it was Future Shock, and I think Neil Gaiman was being interviewed in it, and he was talking about how Moore and him were sitting and talking, I think at a con or something, and Gaiman cornered him and said, "You have to tell me how you would end Halo Jones." And the way Gaiman would relate this back to the documentary made me so not angry, but upset that I would never hear the story straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak, not to insult Mr. Moore, but Gaiman said that he was weeping by the end of it. Halo doesn't end, and because of that, you're left yearning. You yearn as Halo yearns. She wants out, you want in. You want to know what this whole story is about.
But being left wanting more isn't necessarily a bad experience.
Yeah.
To be left being able to kind of build what you think could happen.
It's like the last fleeting moments of a movie that made you cry. And it's just like that wistful moment where like some pop song that made you cry also another time comes together, and it's this confluence of wistfulness. And then it cuts to black and the first credits roll and the music swells and your heart swells with it. That's what the last page of Halo Jones does. And it leaves it on that particular high, but there is this like, there is an ellipsis attached to it that makes you wonder. And so with Gibson, he talks about how, because he had an idea of where the story was going with Moore. It's like you have an idea of how she transcended or was so transcendent in her own world, because in the end of the story, if Gibson's to be believed, she literally transcends the universe in the end. Like she slips the boundaries of space and time by the very end. I mean, that's what I read. I don't know if that's actually how the story ends, but there is a profound beauty in that, especially if you get to experience the narrative tracks towards the end of that path. But we'll never know.
I just think it's interesting and great that a story that's so incomplete can still feel so... You can still feel such satisfaction at its finale.
Yeah.
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 Because it does. It's still a very satisfying finale as far as it's... I don't know. It's the best kind of ending you can have when it's not really an ending.
It's true.
I've said before on the podcast, I've very strong feelings about the end of Halo Jones, because I absolutely maintain it is the best ending we could ever have had.
I think it's a really good ending.
I'm with you.
And as far as you were talking about the theme of out, to end on that, yeah, it works.
The thing she'd been yearning for all that time, the web snapped and she was out. She could go wherever she wanted and do whatever she wanted. And I kind of there's always a desire for more, more without an E. Oh no, more with only one O. Let's put it that way. And that, I think, just thinking about that emotion that you described there, Jarrod, of that kind of that swelling music and the curtains coming down and the emotion of the finale. I think sometimes pop culture can chase that like a dragon, really. You know, and always wanting more, always wanting to remain in that state of euphoria without necessarily understanding it's only euphoric because of the stuff that you've been through to get to that point. You know, it's the kind of Gone with the Wind notion. You know, that line at the end only lands because of everything that's already happened.
Yeah, you've got to trudge through the lows to get to the highs.
Yeah,
exactly. So for me, it's kind of I think the longer the strip would have gone on, the greater the likelihood that perhaps Moore would have got bored of it. Gibson would have got bored of it. You know, they might have had to bring in other artists on the strip, or you know, the chances of it diluting what was there would have been greater. But you know, fair play to him. He had a whole thing. But I think, yeah, for me, it's the perfect ending. She got out. What more could we want for our hero in that moment?
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, guys, we've been talking for a while, and we'll be editing out all the all the internet freezes and the pauses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, leave them in. Leave them in. Come on.
But yeah, I want to thank you both for taking the time to do this. It's been absolutely fascinating to get your perspective on Halo, particularly because you know you've come to it at different times in your lives, and you've got a different cultural perspective on it. You know, I just like talking about this stuff.
No, it's great
same.
to get to talk about such an awesome series. So thanks for having us on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Super stuff. Well, thank you to Jarrod and to MJ, and also to Cooper for giving the cat's view of things. We're going to be doing more deep dives in the future, so if there's a series you'd really like us to focus on, then drop us a line at thrillcast, all one word, at 2000ad.com. Now, we're going to be back next week with another couple of episodes of the Lockdown Tapes, one which is going to be very special. We got some great feedback on the Brian Bolland episode from the other week, and so we thought we would do something special. The episode at the beginning of next week, which will hopefully going out on Tuesday, it will be not only Brian Bolland, not only Dave Gibbons, but also Mick McMahon, three of the all-time greatest 2000 AD artists and giants in the industry. We got them on Zoom, just chatting away, swapping stories, talking about their own experiences of being artists, the physical aspect, you know, the paper they were using, the pens they were using, all the way up to funny things that happened when they were sharing studios or got to know each other. And yeah, it was wonderful to have just three giants just talking, swapping stories, nothing too massive, revelatory. But yeah, it's so rare to be able to, outside of conventions, I guess, get people like that talking together and swapping stories and reminiscences and anecdotes. So it was a real privilege to be able to sit in on that and occasionally ask a question. So yeah, that'll hopefully be going up on Tuesday. Don't miss it. Help spread the word. And thank you for all the great feedback about the Thrillcast Lockdown Tapes. So we're going to be back in a few days with Bolland, McMahon and Gibbons. And until then, we hope you have a good weekend. Things are still not great at the moment. A lot of argy-bargy out there. And above all else, whether you're a reader, whether you just listen to the Thrillcast, please stay safe. Please take care of yourselves and others. And we will undoubtedly see you all on the other side of this. So until next time, Earthlets, Splundig Verthrig.
Alert! 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 Fill power levels dangerously high. Alert! Alert! Read 2000 AD every week. Ask your comic book store or newsagent now. Subscribe to the galaxy's greatest comic at 2000adonline.com.